The sun beat down mercilessly on Redemption Creek as Elijah Owens rode into town, his shadow stretching long across the dusty main street like the specter of his reputation. Folks said he had ice in his veins instead of blood, and the set of his jaw beneath the wide brim of his black hat did little to dispute the claim. His Winchester rifle gleamed in its saddle holster, telling its own silent story of why strangers stepped aside when he passed. It was the spring of 1878, and the town was still raw at its edges, caught between the promise of civilization and the lawless frontier that had spawned it. Elijah dismounted outside the general store, his spurs jangling a warning as his boots hit the dirt. He wasn't planning to stay in Redemption Creek any longer than necessary, just long enough to gather supplies and move on, as had been his pattern for the past 5 years. The bell above the store's door announced his arrival, but it was the sudden hush of conversation that truly marked his entrance. Women gathered their children closer. Men stiffened and found reasons to study the merchandise on the shelves. Elijah was used to this reception. He preferred it this way. "Afternoon," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "Need some coffee, ammunition, and jerky. Whatever you've got that'll keep on the trail." The storekeeper, a balding man with nervous hands, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, Mr. Owens, right away." As the man bustled about gathering the requested items, the door chimed again. Elijah kept his back to the entrance, a habit born of caution, but watched the newcomer's reflection in the window glass. It was a woman, slender and determined, her honey-brown hair caught up in a practical knot at the nape of her neck. "Mr. Peterson, I need those medical supplies we discussed," she said, her voice cultured but firm. "Dr. Miller says Mrs. Thornton's fever is worsening." The storekeeper glanced between Elijah and the woman, clearly torn between which customer to serve first. "Of course, Miss Adler. Let me just finish with Mr. Owens here." Elijah turned slowly. "The lady's business sounds more pressing than mine." For the first time, the woman Miss Adler truly looked at him. Her eyes widened slightly, a reaction he was accustomed to. People had heard stories about Elijah Owens, the man who'd gunned down the notorious Blackwater gang single-handedly, who'd tracked outlaws across 3 territories and brought them back dead or alive, mostly dead. What they didn't know was why. "Thank you," she said, her eyes a startling shade of green against her sun-kissed skin. "But I can wait my turn." "I insist," Elijah said, stepping aside. Mr. Peterson hurried to gather the medical supplies, explaining, "Miss Rebecca Adler is our schoolteacher, Mr. Owens. She also assists Dr. Miller when things get busy." Elijah nodded curtly, not particularly interested in the woman's occupation, yet finding his gaze returning to her as she checked the supplies. There was something in the efficient way she moved, the calm assurance in her manner, that held his attention. "These will do," Rebecca said, placing coins on the counter. As she gathered her packages, she turned to Elijah. "You're new to Redemption Creek." It wasn't a question. "Passing through," he replied. "Most people are." Her gaze was direct, unafraid. "Safe travels, Mr. Owens." After she left, Elijah completed his transaction in silence, but found himself oddly distracted. He'd encountered plenty of women in his travels, widows, saloon girls, farmers' daughters, but few had looked at him with such clear-eyed assessment, as if seeing past the gun and reputation to the man beneath. He shook off the strange feeling as he loaded his supplies onto his horse. Redemption Creek was just another dusty town, and he had miles to cover before nightfall. But fate had other plans. As Elijah prepared to mount up, gunshots echoed from the far end of town, followed by shouts and the thunder of hooves. 4 riders tore down the main street, firing wildly into the air. Behind them, the bank door stood open, and a man lay sprawled on the boardwalk outside. Instinctively, Elijah stepped back into the shadow of the building, assessing the situation with practiced eyes. Bank robbery. Not his problem. He'd learned long ago that playing hero brought nothing but grief. Then he saw her Rebecca Adler pushing a young boy to safety as one of the riders spotted her and veered in her direction. The outlaw's intentions were written clear across his ugly face as he reached down to grab her. Elijah's Winchester was in his hands before he made a conscious decision. The shot rang out, and the outlaw tumbled from his saddle, missing Rebecca by inches. The other robbers wheeled around, searching for the source of the shot. Elijah fired again, dropping another man. The remaining outlaws split up, one racing out of town while the other ducked behind the water trough, returning fire wildly. Bullets splintered the wood near Elijah's head. He rolled, came up on one knee, and put a bullet through the man's shoulder, sending his gun flying. The street fell silent except for the wounded outlaw's groans and the distant hoofbeats of his escaping partner. Elijah approached cautiously, keeping his rifle trained on the injured man. "Someone fetch the sheriff," he called, his voice carrying across the stunned onlookers, "and the doctor." Rebecca was already kneeling beside the man who'd been shot outside the bank, her hands pressing a handkerchief against his bleeding shoulder. "He's alive," she announced. "It's Mr. Wilson, the teller." The sheriff arrived moments later, a heavy-set man with a salt-and-pepper mustache and suspicious eyes. "Owens," he said gruffly. "Should have known you'd bring trouble." "Didn't bring it," Elijah replied evenly. "Just ended it." "Sheriff Davis," Rebecca interrupted. "Mr. Owens just saved lives. These men would have escaped with the bank's money and possibly taken hostages." Davis grunted, clearly unhappy to be corrected, but he set about organizing deputies to secure the wounded robbers and search for the one who'd escaped. Elijah, meanwhile, slipped away from the crowd. He'd had enough attention for one day. He was halfway to his horse when Rebecca caught up with him. "You're leaving?" she asked, her cheeks flushed from exertion. "Nothing to stay for," he replied. "The town will want to thank you," she insisted. "And your arm needs tending." She gestured to his sleeve where blood darkened the fabric. Elijah glanced down, surprised. In the heat of the moment, he hadn't felt the bullet graze him. "It's nothing. It needs cleaning at least. Infection kills more men than bullets out here." Her tone brooked no argument. "My house is just down the street. I have supplies." Something about her steady gaze made Elijah pause. It had been a long time since anyone had shown concern for his well-being, longer still since he'd allowed it. But there was something about Rebecca Adler that made his usual walls seem less necessary. 5 minutes, he conceded finally. Her home was small but immaculate, with bookshelves lining one wall and simple, practical furnishings. It smelled of lavender and fresh bread. While she gathered medical supplies, Elijah stood awkwardly in her kitchen, feeling out of place among such domestic tranquility. "Remove your shirt, please," she instructed, setting a basin of water on the table. Elijah hesitated, then complied, unwilling to shed his gun belt, even in these surroundings. The wound was a shallow furrow along his upper arm, painful but not serious. Rebecca worked efficiently, cleaning the wound with sure, gentle hands. "You've been shot before," she observed, noting other scars on his torso. "Hazard of the profession." "And what profession is that exactly?" Bounty hunter? Lawman? Her eyes met his. Outlaw. Former lawman, he answered after a pause. Now I just handle problems. For money? Sometimes. He winced slightly as she applied antiseptic. Sometimes for other reasons. She bandaged his arm with neat precision. What brings you to Redemption Creek, Mr. Owens? We don't have many problems that need handling. Just passing through, he repeated, heading north. Alone? The question was casual, but her eyes were perceptive. Always. He stood, pulling his shirt back on. Thank you for the doctoring, Miss Adler. Rebecca, she corrected him. And you're welcome, Elijah. The sound of his name on her lips gave him pause. Few people used it anymore. He was Owens or Mr., or occasionally more colorful epithets. He'd almost forgotten how it sounded spoken softly. You should stay for dinner, she continued, washing her hands in the basin, as thanks. Not necessary. Not necessary, perhaps, but offered all the same. She turned to face him, challenge in her eyes. Unless you're afraid of a home-cooked meal and civilized conversation. Elijah almost smiled at that, almost. I've faced worse, I suppose. Rebecca's cooking proved to be as efficient as her medical skills. A simple stew, biscuits, and canned peaches for dessert. They ate mostly in silence, but it was surprisingly comfortable. When they did speak, Rebecca told him about the town, how she'd come west 2 years ago from Boston to teach, how Redemption Creek was growing, struggling to shed its rough beginnings and become a proper community. And you? She asked eventually. Where is home for you? Elijah set down his spoon. Nowhere these days. Everyone comes from somewhere. He studied her face, wondering why he felt inclined to answer truthfully. Colorado. Had a small ranch there once. What happened? The old pain surfaced, dull now with time but still present. Rustlers came while I was away. My wife and son were there alone. He didn't need to finish the story. Rebecca's eyes filled with understanding. I'm sorry, she said simply. It was a long time ago. 8 years, 4 months, and 17 days. But who was counting? Is that why you became whatever you are now? Elijah stood, uncomfortable with how easily she'd uncovered his past. I should go. Thank you for the meal. But when he reached the door, Rebecca spoke again. The town is holding a social tomorrow night to celebrate the bank not being robbed, if nothing else. Her smile was wry. You'd be welcome. I'll be gone by morning, he said, settling his hat on his head. Of course. She didn't look surprised. Safe travels. Elijah Owens. But as he walked to the livery stable where he'd arranged lodging for his horse, Elijah found himself strangely reluctant to leave Redemption Creek. It was foolishness, of course. One meal with a pretty schoolteacher didn't change who he was or the life he'd chosen. The next morning dawned with an unseasonable chill, a light rain falling from leaden skies. Elijah told himself it was just good sense to delay his departure. No point in riding out in weather that would only worsen his arm. He spent the day in the town's small hotel, cleaning his weapons and watching the rain-slicked street from his window. He spotted Rebecca twice, once hurrying to the schoolhouse with a shawl pulled over her head and later visiting the doctor's office, presumably to check on the wounded bank teller. Each time, he drew back from the window, unwilling to acknowledge his interest. By evening, the rain had stopped, but Elijah still hadn't ridden out. He told himself he'd leave at first light, but when he heard music and laughter from the direction of the town hall, his feet carried him there almost against his will. The social was in full swing when he arrived. Lanterns cast a warm glow over tables laden with food, and a small band played lively tunes while couples danced. Elijah stood in the doorway, already regretting his decision when Sheriff Davis approached. "Didn't expect to see you here, Owens," he said, but his tone lacked the previous day's hostility. "Town council asked me to convey their thanks for your help yesterday. The bank's offering a reward." "Not necessary," Elijah replied. His eyes scanned the room, finding Rebecca among a group of women. She wore a blue dress that brought out the green of her eyes, her hair arranged in soft curls around her face. She was laughing at something, and the sound carried across the room, bright and genuine. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up. Surprise crossed her features, then a warm smile that made something in Elijah's chest constrict painfully. She excused herself from her companions and crossed to where he stood. "You decided to stay after all," she observed. "The rain," he explained lamely. "Of course." Her eyes danced with amusement, nothing to do with curiosity about our little town celebration. Before he could respond, a tall man with carefully combed hair approached, smiling broadly at Rebecca. "Miss Adler, I believe this next dance is mine." Rebecca hesitated, glancing at Elijah. "Mr. Foster, have you met Mr. Owens? He's the one who stopped the bank robbery yesterday." Foster extended a hand that Elijah reluctantly shook. "The town is grateful, sir. Now, if you'll excuse us." He led Rebecca to the dance floor, one hand possessively at her waist. Elijah watched them join the other couples, Foster leaning close to say something that made Rebecca smile politely. "That's Edwin Foster," said a voice at Elijah's elbow. A plump, cheerful woman had appeared beside him. "Owns the largest ranch outside town. Been courting our Rebecca for months now, though she hasn't given him much encouragement, if you ask me." Elijah made a non-committal sound, uncomfortable with both the information and the implied confidence. "I'm Martha Wilson, by the way," the woman continued. "My husband's the one you saved at the bank. Doctor says he'll recover fully, thanks to you." "Just happened to be there," Elijah muttered. "Well, we're grateful all the same." She studied him with motherly interest. "You know, Rebecca was asking about you today. Seemed concerned you'd left without a proper goodbye." The dance ended, and Elijah watched as Foster led Rebecca toward the refreshment table, his hand still at her waist. Something unfamiliar and uncomfortable twisted in Elijah's gut. Jealousy, he realized with shock, a sentiment he had no right to feel. "Excuse me," he said to Mrs. Wilson, and headed for the door. He needed air, needed distance from the warmth and normalcy of the gathering that made his isolation feel suddenly unbearable. Outside, the night air was cool and damp after the rain. Elijah leaned against the building's wall, breathing deeply. He was a fool for coming here, for allowing himself even a moment to imagine he could be part of such a world again. "Leaving so soon?" Rebecca's voice startled him. She stood a few feet away, her shawl draped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "This isn't my kind of gathering," he said. "What is your kind?" she challenged. "Lonely campfires and silent nights under the stars." The accuracy of her assessment made him uncomfortable. "There's nothing wrong with solitude." "No," she agreed, moving closer. "But there's nothing particularly right about it either, when it's all you allow yourself." Elijah straightened, irritation flaring. "You don't know me, Miss Adler. I know you're running from something more than just those rustlers who took your family," she said quietly. "I know pain when I see it, Elijah. I've had my share." "Your share?" His laugh was harsh. What would a Boston schoolteacher know about real pain? Her eyes flashed. My fiancé died in the war, my parents in a fire 2 years later. I came west because there was nothing left for me in Boston except memories. She lifted her chin. We all have our scars, Mr. Owens. Some of us just don't use them as an excuse to stop living. The words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment he couldn't speak, could only stare at this woman who'd so accurately diagnosed the disease he'd been carrying for years. I should apologize, he said finally. Yes, you should. But her expression had softened. Dance with me instead. I don't dance. Everyone dances, she insisted, even cold, dangerous gunmen with tortured pasts. Again, that almost smile tugged at his lips. You're very persistent, Miss Adler. Rebecca, she corrected. And yes, I am. She held out her hand. One dance, and then you can return to your brooding if you prefer. Something about her courage, her directness, the understanding in her eyes made it impossible to refuse. Elijah took her hand and allowed her to lead him back inside to the edge of the dance floor. The band had started a slower tune, and couples swayed together in the lantern light. Awkwardly, he placed his hand at her waist, taking her other hand in his. It had been so long since he'd touched a woman with gentleness that he felt clumsy, oversized. But Rebecca moved with easy grace, guiding him into the rhythm of the music. See? Not so terrible, she murmured, looking up at him with those remarkable eyes. Elijah was acutely aware of her nearness. The subtle scent of lavender that he'd noticed in her home, the warmth of her hand in his. His heart hammered against his ribs like a green boy's, and to his dismay, he felt his fingers trembling slightly where they rested at her waist. The dance ended too soon, and as they stood together at the edge of the floor, he realized he was still holding her hand. He released it abruptly, clearing his throat. Thank you for the dance, Miss Rebecca. Across the room, Edwin Foster was watching them, his expression darkening. Elijah stepped back, suddenly conscious of how their interaction might appear to the townspeople, the respectable schoolteacher and the dangerous drifter. Your admirer looks unhappy, he observed. Rebecca glanced at Foster and sighed. Edwin has certain expectations that I've never encouraged. He seems established, respected. Elijah wasn't sure why he was saying these things, except perhaps to remind himself of the gulf between their worlds. Yes, and terribly dull, she replied with surprising candor. He talks of nothing but cattle prices and land acquisitions. Her eyes met Elijah's. I prefer more interesting conversation. Before he could respond, Foster approached, his smile tight. Rebecca, dear, I was hoping for another dance. Actually, Edwin, I was just telling Mr. Owens about our town history. Did you know he's interested in the old silver mine outside town? Elijah blinked at the blatant fabrication, but kept his expression neutral. Foster frowned. The abandoned one? Nothing there but old timbers and bad air. Perhaps, Rebecca said, but it's a significant part of our local history. I thought perhaps tomorrow I might show Mr. Owens the old trail there, since he's expressed such interest. Foster's displeasure was evident, but his manners prevented him from objecting outright. Well, it's a difficult trail. Perhaps I should accompany you. Oh, I wouldn't want to take you away from your ranch duties, Rebecca said smoothly. Mr. Owens and I will manage quite well, I'm sure. After Foster reluctantly departed, Elijah raised an eyebrow at Rebecca. The silver mine? A mischievous smile curved her lips. It does exist, and the trail there is quite lovely this time of year. Unless, of course, you still plan to leave at first light. It was a challenge, clear as day. Elijah knew the sensible response. The only response was to reaffirm his intention to leave. Instead, he heard himself say, "I suppose one more day wouldn't make much difference." The pleased surprise in her eyes was worth the momentary lapse in judgment. "Excellent. Shall we say 9 o'clock? We can make a day of it." As Elijah lay awake in his rented room that night, he told himself repeatedly that he was being foolish. One more day would become 2, then a week. And for what? Nothing could come of his interest in Rebecca Adler. He was a man with enemies, a man whose very presence brought danger. The memory of his wife and child was testament enough to that bitter truth. Yet when morning came, he found himself at Rebecca's door at 9 o'clock sharp, his horse saddled and laden with the picnic lunch she'd suggested they bring. She emerged wearing a practical riding skirt and boots, her hair braided simply down her back. The sight of her, so natural and unaffected, made his chest ache. They rode out of town side by side, Rebecca leading the way toward the foothills where the abandoned silver mine was located. The spring day was perfect sunshine, a light breeze, wildflowers dotting the grasslands. Despite his better judgment, Elijah found himself relaxing in Rebecca's company. She was an excellent horsewoman, he noted, and knowledgeable about the land. As they rode, she pointed out landmarks and told him stories of the area's settlement, how Redemption Creek had started as a mining camp before the silver played out, then reinvented itself as a cattle town. "And what brought you here, specifically?" he asked as they paused to rest the horses beside a clear stream. "Out of all the western towns needing teachers?" Rebecca trailed her fingers in the water, thoughtful. "Desperation, initially. I needed work and they needed a teacher." She smiled. "But I've grown to love it. These children have so little, and education can give them choices their parents never had." "You've made a difference here," Elijah observed. It wasn't a question. "I try." She looked up at him. "What about you? What are you seeking on this endless journey of yours?" The question caught him off guard. "I'm not seeking anything." "Everyone is seeking something, Elijah. Peace, redemption, purpose." Her eyes were too perceptive. "What is it you hope to find?" He turned away, uncomfortable with her insight. "We should keep moving if we want to reach the mine by noon." The trail grew steeper, winding through pine forests and rocky outcroppings. They rode mostly in silence, but it was companionable rather than strained. Eventually, they reached a clearing where the dilapidated entrance to the old mine was visible, timber supports weathered and sagging. "Not much to look at now," Rebecca said, dismounting. "But 30 years ago, this mine made several men very wealthy before it played out." They secured their horses and approached the mine entrance cautiously. "Is it safe?" Elijah asked, eyeing the dubious supports. "The first chamber is. Beyond that, it's collapsed." She ducked under a timber, entering the cool darkness. "Come see." Elijah followed, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The chamber was larger than he'd expected, with the remnants of old equipment scattered about. Shafts of sunlight penetrated through cracks in the ceiling, illuminating dust motes swirling in the still air. "The miners used to say there was a much richer vein deeper in the mountain," Rebecca said, her voice echoing slightly. "But a cave-in killed 3 men, and they abandoned it rather than risk more lives." "Wise choice," Elijah commented. "No fortune is worth a man's life." "Yet men risk their lives for fortune every day." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Or for revenge." He stiffened. "What makes you say that?" Your reputation precedes you, Elijah. They say you hunted down every last member of the gang that killed your family. It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. Yes. Did it bring you peace? The blunt query struck him silent. Had it? The last outlaw had died at his hands 2 years ago, his vengeance complete. Yet here he still was, drifting, hollow. No, he admitted finally. But it was justice. Justice and peace aren't always the same thing, she observed quietly. Come on, let's have our lunch outside in the sunshine. This place always makes me melancholy. They spread their picnic on a blanket in a sunny meadow near the mine. Rebecca had packed bread, cheese, cold chicken, and apple tarts. They ate in comfortable silence, watching clouds drift overhead and listening to birdsong from the nearby trees. What will you do? Rebecca asked eventually, now that your quest for justice is complete. Elijah had been asking himself the same question for 2 years. Keep moving, I suppose. It's what I know. Is it what you want? Again, her directness unsettled him. What I want doesn't signify much anymore. It signifies everything, she countered. The past is fixed, Elijah. The future is still yours to shape. He studied her face, the determination in her eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth, the strand of honey-brown hair that had escaped her braid to curl against her cheek. The impulse to reach out, to touch that errant strand, was almost overwhelming. You make it sound simple, he said. Not simple. Possible. She held his gaze. There's a place for you somewhere, if you're willing to look for it. Here? The word escaped before he could stop it. Her eyes widened slightly, then softened. Perhaps. Redemption Creek could use a man with your skills. Sheriff Davis isn't getting any younger. The idea was absurd him. A town lawman again, settling in one place, becoming part of a community. And yet, looking at Rebecca, he couldn't dismiss it entirely. Their ride back to town was quieter. Both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Redemption Creek, the setting sun gilded the simple buildings with golden light, transforming the dusty frontier town into something almost beautiful. I have school tomorrow, Rebecca said as they reached her house, but perhaps you might come for dinner again if you're still in town. Elijah hesitated. Every instinct honed by years of solitary wandering told him to refuse, to ride out tonight, to leave behind this dangerous temptation, to hope for something different. But looking at Rebecca in the sunset light, he found he couldn't form the words of refusal. I'll be here, he said instead. Her smile was like sunrise. 7 o'clock then. That night, Elijah once again lay awake in his rented room, but his thoughts were different. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a different future, one with a home, a purpose beyond vengeance, perhaps even someone to share it with. The vision was simultaneously tempting and terrifying. The next morning, he found himself wandering the streets of Redemption Creek with new eyes, noting the potential in the growing town. There was a vacant building that might serve as a law office and jail, sturdier than the current makeshift arrangement. The livery stable had good horses. The hotel was clean and well managed. His steps led him past the schoolhouse where he paused, listening to Rebecca's voice as she led her students through a geography lesson. The normality of it, the simple rightness, made his throat tighten. Thinking of enrolling? Sheriff Davis's voice startled him. The older man had approached silently, eyeing Elijah with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. Just passing by, Elijah replied. Davis grunted. Miss Adler's a fine teacher. Town's lucky to have her. He gave Elijah a pointed look. She deserves a good man, someone stable. You understand my meaning? The implication was clear. A man like Elijah had no business showing interest in a woman like Rebecca. The worst part was, Davis was right. Perfectly, Elijah said coldly, and walked away. He spent the afternoon at the saloon, nursing a whiskey, and trying to convince himself that leaving was the only sensible option. By the time he approached Rebecca's house that evening, he'd made his decision. He would have dinner with her, thank her for her kindness, and be on his way by morning. It was the right thing, the only thing to do. Rebecca answered his knock with a smile that faltered when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he lied, removing his hat as he entered. Her home smelled of roasting beef and fresh bread, welcoming and homey. It made what he had to say even harder. "Rebecca, before you say anything," she interrupted, "I have something to show you." She took his hand, leading him to her small study where papers were spread across the desk. "I spoke with Mayor Collins today about the town's need for a proper lawman." Elijah stared at the documents, a proposed contract for a town marshal with a salary, housing allowance, and official duties outlined in neat script. "The town council is meeting tomorrow to discuss it," Rebecca continued. "They're willing to consider your appointment, given your experience and how you handled the bank robbers." "You did this?" Elijah asked, stunned by the gesture. "I merely suggested the possibility," she said. "The town has needed proper law enforcement for some time. Sheriff Davis is really just a volunteer with a badge." Elijah shook his head, torn between gratitude for her effort and dismay at the complication it presented. "Rebecca, I can't stay here." Her face fell. "Can't or won't. Both." He moved away from the desk, away from her. "You don't understand what I am, what I've done." "Then help me understand," she challenged, following him. "Explain why a man who clearly yearns for connection continues to deny himself the possibility." "Because people around me get hurt." The words burst from him with unexpected force. "My wife and son died because I made enemies. Because I was a lawman who did his job too well, and the Blackwater gang decided to make an example of my family while I was away chasing other outlaws." The old pain surged fresh. "I won't risk that again. I won't put anyone else in danger because they matter to me." Rebecca's expression softened. "Elijah, what happened to your family was a terrible tragedy. But punishing yourself with endless solitude won't bring them back or honor their memory." "It's not punishment," he insisted. "It's protection." "For whom?" she demanded. "Those outlaws are dead by your own hand. Who are you protecting now, except yourself from the risk of caring again?" Her words struck too close to the truth. Elijah turned away, struggling to maintain his composure. "You don't know what you're asking." "I'm asking you to consider the possibility of a future instead of being haunted by the past," she said, her voice gentler now. "I'm asking you to be brave enough to try living again, not just existing." "And if history repeats itself?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "What then?" Rebecca moved to stand before him, her eyes steady on his. "Life offers no guarantees, Elijah. Not to any of us. We can only make the best choices we can with the time we're given." Slowly, hesitantly, she reached up to touch his face. It was the first time anyone had touched him with such tenderness in years, and to his mortification, he felt his hands begin to tremble. He captured her fingers against his cheek, closing his eyes against the swell of feeling. "I don't know if I remember how," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "How to be part of something, how to care without fear." You remember, she whispered. I can see it in your eyes when you let your guard down. Feel it in your hands now. She turned her face, pressing a soft kiss to his palm. You just need to give yourself permission to try. The simple gesture broke something open inside him, a floodgate of emotion he'd kept carefully dammed for years. His other hand came up to cradle her face, and when their eyes met, he saw in hers the same longing, the same hope that had begun to grow in his own heart. Rebecca, he murmured, and then he was kissing her, gently at first, then with growing urgency as she responded, her arms sliding around his neck, drawing him closer. When they finally parted, both breathless, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. I can't promise this will work, he warned. I've been alone a long time. So have I, she replied, but I'm willing to try if you are. The dinner grew cold as they talked late into the night, sharing stories of their pasts, their losses, and tentative hopes for the future. For the first time in years, Elijah spoke of his wife and son, not just as victims whose deaths demanded vengeance, but as people he had loved, whose memory deserved more than his perpetual suffering. In turn, Rebecca told him of her fiancé who'd never returned from Gettysburg, of the fire that claimed her parents, of her decision to seek a new life in the West rather than drowning in grief in familiar surroundings. We're more alike than different, she observed as midnight approached, both trying to outrun pain but in opposite ways. You by avoiding connections, me by seeking them. And which approach worked better? He asked with the ghost of a smile. Neither, entirely, she admitted, but perhaps together we can find a better way. The next morning, Elijah attended the town council meeting. The discussion was lengthy, with some members expressing reservations about his past, others championing his experience. In the end, they offered him a 6-month trial as town marshal, with the possibility of permanent appointment thereafter. I accept, Elijah said, surprising himself with how right the decision felt. But I have one condition. I need to bring in the last bank robber who escaped. I won't start this job with unfinished business. The council agreed, and 3 days later, Elijah rode out of Redemption Creek, following the outlaws' trail north. But this time was different. This time, he had a reason to return. It took 2 weeks to track down the escaped robber, a hardened criminal named Jenkins who'd rejoined his gang in Wyoming territory. Elijah brought him back alive, though not without a skirmish that left him with a fresh scar across his ribs. Rebecca was waiting when he rode into town, the prisoner bound and secured on a second horse. Her face showed relief, then concern, as she noticed his careful movements when he dismounted. You're hurt, she said as he handed Jenkins over to the deputy. Nothing serious, he assured her. Already healing. That night, after his wound was properly tended and Jenkins was secured in the new jail, Elijah and Rebecca walked together under a canopy of stars. The town was quiet, peaceful in a way that seemed to seep into his very bones. I rented the Sanders place, he told her. It's small but sound. Needs some work. Rebecca smiled up at him. It's a good house, close to the school too. I noticed that. He hesitated, then took her hand in his. Rebecca, I don't know what the future holds. I'm still learning how to be something other than what I've been these past years. But I know I want to try. With you, if you'll have me. In answer, she rose on tiptoe and kissed him, there in the moonlight on Main Street for anyone to see. When she drew back, her eyes were shining. I believe in second chances, Elijah Owens, for both of us. The seasons turned, and Redemption Creek continued to grow. Elijah settled into his role as marshal with a natural authority that earned him the town's respect, if not always their warmth. The coldness that had been his protection for so long thawed gradually, first with Rebecca, then with others who became friends rather than mere acquaintances. They were married that autumn in a simple ceremony at the small church. Rebecca wore a dress of deep blue that matched the forget-me-nots Elijah had tucked into her bouquet. His hands trembled when he placed the ring on her finger, and again when he lifted her veil to kiss his bride, but they were steady when he held her close for their first dance as husband and wife. In the years that followed, Redemption Creek would know its share of troubles, droughts, harsh winters, the occasional outlaw passing through. But it would also know the sight of Marshal Owens walking his young son to school, where Mrs. Owens taught the town's children with the same passion and dedication that had first caught her husband's attention on a spring day when he'd thought himself merely passing through. And sometimes, when the day's duties were done and twilight settled over the town, they would sit together on their porch, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast western sky. In those moments, Elijah would remember the long, lonely years of his wandering and marvel at the journey that had led him, finally, home.